get underway here. I know we're expecting a couple more people, but they'll come in and find their way here directly. We should thank the Virginia Humanities for making this whole project possible. It's really exciting. And thank Tim Eriksen for coming here and sharing his gifts. So, as I said earlier, this project is about exploring liberation and true belonging in community through song. And so, Tim is going to lead us through some things around traditional song today, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah.
Could I just quickly, I want to give them some context for
okay.
So some of you know that my son goes to school in Putney, Vermont, at the Putney School. And I was there at a parent kind of orientation gathering, and Tim's kids also go to the Putney School. So we were at this thing, at this cheese and dip table, talking, and we're just talking. I mean, of course, like, I was drawn to this guy, wondering what his story was, right? And so we start talking, and he's like, I do this eclectic sort of different thing. A lot of people don't know about it. It's called Shape Note Singing. And I was like, I know about that. I'm a Shape Note singer. And so we end up having this conversation, right? And I'm driving home, or getting ready to drive home, and I text Chris Wolf and say, so I met this guy here, his name's Tim Eriksen, Shape Note Singing, and Chris texted me back and said, you just met like a really important guy in this tradition. And I had no idea. So I listened to Tim's music the whole way home from Putney, Vermont, and was completely blown away. I don't think any of you were at the concert last night, but it was amazing.
I was there.
Patty was,
It was
you
amazing.
was, Heather was, yeah, some of us were. Hello, some of us were. It was amazing. And so I'm really excited. I was really kind of driven to bring Tim here to us. And so I really hope you pay attention and learn and have fun with this guy. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so happy to be here, and thanks to both of you guys for making that possible. I'm feeling a little far away. I may.
Move in, or?
Well, I guess it depends. We were trying to figure out how to make room for instruments and things, but I don't know.
Want a chair?
We could kind of try to. Yeah, maybe that's going to.
We do a zigzag.
I'm so used to the Sacred Harp setup, which is just kind of a known quantity, you know, the hollow squares, as tight as possible. Well, I have a bunch of ideas, and I'm really interested to. Sorry to mess up here.
No, you're fine.
And I'm really interested to hear some of your ideas. I know that you're already, the first thing, you know, that I saw coming into school this morning was that you were already practicing some of what you're talking about. Looking at maritime song from the conversation, that could be something that we should spend some time with. And I'd love to learn some of your songs and talk about them a bit. I may be able to provide some context and maybe some connections to other traditions. You know, there are these things that we think of as separate, maritime music and sacred music of different kinds. But when you kind of start poking around at them, it's remarkable how much there is in common between many of these traditions. And some of it because of history and culture. These are kind of American traditions. It's a certain set of groups of people whose cultures have influenced what we think of as American culture. But also because there are things that are sort of fundamentally human. There are things that are commonalities that are expressed in song because people have so many of the same needs and are engaged in so many of the same things. So work songs, I think that maritime music is a fantastic example of that. I don't know if you got to exercise any of that on your sailing expedition, using the song to kind of keep you motivated and also pragmatically to keep you in rhythm. So there are things like that that aren't strictly cultural, but they're really kind of more about achieving a very kind of a clear physical goal of getting from here to there, for example. And music can be a way that can be something that facilitates that kind of sense of belonging that is more felt than spoken. Literally, the sense of contributing to a common goal. So I thought to start by just playing you a little bit, a couple of things of my music, because some of you would have heard last night, that express in some way, that interact with these themes of both belonging and liberation. As we go on, I want to talk about, I want us to sort of explore the ways in which those things can go together and be a really positive force. And also some of the ways in which belonging and liberation, there are things that we belong to that we might want to be liberated from, for example. So, a familiar song that I thought to play, in part because I like it, part because it expresses a sense of longing for belonging, a sense of alienation that's so shot through music. You think of, I don't know what kind of music you listen to, but whether it's blues or punk rock or Wagner, the sense of alienation and the sense of longing to belong and to connect is one of the things that music helps us to express and to achieve, I think. And also because this song is an example of traditional song, but it's hard to say, well, it's this tradition, it's this tradition, it's this tradition. I've heard it called a black spiritual, I've heard it called a white spiritual, I've heard it called, well, it's a shape note song, among other things. I've heard it called old-time music, southern music, but it was sung in New England as well. And strangely enough, it's a Czech song, or Moravian anyway, that was translated into English shortly before the time of the Civil War. And in a kind of sacred context, expresses the sense of, well, as it says in the title, being a wayfaring stranger, longing for that sense of home, connection, true belonging. As well as a liberation from the trials and the tribulations of the everyday. Right land to which I owe. So that was, tomorrow we're going to look more at writing songs as a way of expressing and dealing with these issues. But using available materials, using songs that are already just kind of there, they're in a tradition, can be very powerful, especially if it's something that you have in common. But having said that, you have to think of this as being a new song. You know, when it first came out, people saying, "Whoa, that really hit me." It became traditional because it had such an effect on people, because it expressed things that they were feeling. And you can imagine at the time of the Civil War, especially, sense of being just cut off from everything, being in this kind of neverland of war that's separate from home and familiarity. And then in that context, pretty much in any context, finding ways in which existing songs can bring a sense of belonging and liberation from the connection to the people around you, and the liberation from the difficulties you may be experiencing. So there's stories about during the Civil War, people on both sides singing sacred music together, and a popular song as well. There's stories of encampments where the Union and Confederacy, there'd be soldiers from either side singing together, basically singing familiar songs, even at the same time that they were there to kill each other and to fight. There was still a sense of togetherness that they had through a shared culture, through not just religion, but through their musical culture and just their shared humanity, just the shared feelings of being separated, alienated. Music is one of the very best tools for working through those kind of situations. I thought I'd play you one more and then ask you to maybe show me something. This is partly just to give some of you who haven't heard my music before just a little taste of what I do. And this is one that in a bit maybe we could all learn to play together. It's a march tune. We'll talk about belonging, being together. Rhythm is one of those, we all have two sides, and expressing that in music is a primal way of getting us all together. For better or for worse, I have a friend who can't stand Sacred Harp singing. His family on one side Polish Jews. He says when he sees a bunch of people getting together and singing loudly, it's terrifying. It doesn't matter what kind of music it is. You know, being together doesn't mean doing good. Belonging can be, it all depends on what you're belonging to. But this song celebrates something I think we can all be okay with, which is friendship. Which is a very big theme in, well, forever, but around the time of the Revolutionary War, friendship as a kind of a classical value was shot through all the whole culture. So anyway, this is a drinking song / shape note hymn / march tune called Friendship. Friendship to every willing mind opens a heavenly treasure. There in the songs of song find sources of real pleasure. See what employments men pursue, then you belong, my words are true. Friendship alone unfolds to view, sources of real pleasure. False are the joys which fools esteem, fading and transitory. As fleeting as a dream, all of the mystic story. Luxury leaves a sting behind, wounding the body and the mind. Only in friendship can we find pleasure and solid glory. Happy the man who has a friend formed by the God of nature. Well may he feel and recommend friendship for his creator. Then as eyes in friendship join, so that our social powers combine, ruled by the passion most divine, friendship for our creator. Do you have any questions or comments before we go on? Am I making sense more or less so far? I don't want to be the only one talking.
Where's it published as a Shape Note?
Well, it's all right. So the first American publication was in a Western Massachusetts book from 1798 called The American Musical Miscellany. Then there's a guy in Maine named Moses Springer who changed the word friendship to Jesus. He just changed out one word. And then it showed up in a couple of New England books. And the first shape note book it showed up in, I'm aware of, with actual shape notes, was the Christian Harmony. And it's since been reprinted in the Shenandoah Harmony, you know, in the last 5 years or so. It was kind of went under the radar for a while. It's one of those great tunes that disappeared and has reappeared. Well, I was hoping that you guys could show me a song or two, or show us who haven't been a part of your semester, some of what you've been doing with maritime song, or whatever you do. You clearly use song in some of the ways that we're talking about. And I understand movement dance as well, which is...
Sure. I mean, one of the first tunes we sung all together as a school was "I Walked Abroad," and it's something most of the kids probably don't need music for, but I have it anyways, and I think we have enough for other folks to look on. So maybe we can pass it around a little bit, and if we don't have enough, y'all can share. And this doesn't necessarily speak to the project themes in its in the poetry as much as in the experience, because all of a sudden, when you learn to tune well enough that you can just break out into harmony anywhere you happen to be, there is a real sense of belonging. And it's like we've done this together. And let's see. And so you sing in high harmony. I've got Cassie and Evelyn.
I would do high harmony.
No.
I really want people in the high harmony because I cut hard up about Sarah very well.
Great. Maybe Tim will sing treble with you. That'll help.
And Chris, I can also help.
Great.
I don't know high harmony by heart. I only know the melody. Alright, Chris,
Yeah.
you're high with us, please.
Sure. I was going to sing the bass. What do you think?
Hey, David. Can you have
Yeah, I'm high on my fancy. Yeah.
So, most of y'all are initiated into the ways of the shape notes, and if you're not, on this particular tune, there's three voices. We've got a high harmony, we've got a melody in the middle, and we've got a bass on the bottom. And the first time through, we sing the shapes. Yeah, don't feel like you need to get into your parts.
Oh, we don't need to get into
Like, want to sing high, Jenny?
With just the melody and the bass.
Evelyn. Melody is really like
shapes. You have bombs, triangles, and cloud. You have souls round like the sun. Your lob, it's like two L's coming together for a square, and diamonds are for me. And if you flub them going through, don't sweat it. Until you learn them, they're not helpful. Once you learn them, they're amazing. Love, shapes, love, shapes. So I'd be curious to hear from students who at the beginning of this year hadn't ever seen a shape note, hadn't really done much harmony singing, and we've gone from zero to something. And now I'll hear you singing in harmony without music, just outside on a walk. And what's that been like, or is there anything that you want to speak to in that experience?
If you don't, I will, though. I'd like to hear.
For me, it's when I came here, my whole life I've wanted to sing harmony with people. Never really had an opportunity. Anyone who wants to sing with me and really doesn't know how, doesn't understand harmony, and so coming here has really scratched that itch a lot.
Yeah, it's really cool to like break out in song because you really feel like you're like part of like a community when you just start singing and then everyone else starts singing along because they know the song and it's like, oh, everyone knows the same song and we can sing together.
Yeah, it was, I remember when I first like came in, it was pretty like, when I first started and then like, and then like as we got into it, I started enjoying it more and more. And I didn't like, not never, I didn't understand like the entire point of the notes. And yeah, and then like as I just figured like how much more like helpful it is and how much like, how it completely changes how that entire thing works. I also just found that yesterday that that's what do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do means. It totally just blew my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a cool moment when you know it well enough that you're going to hear it. This one especially, since we've been doing it since the beginning.
For me, well, first of all, it sounds just lovely. I mean, it's clear that you're doing it. I'm not just going through the motions. I had a moment last night at the concert when I was just talking with some people I'd never met before. And we were thinking, just looking for connections, and I was talking about a friend who taught me this song. I am a stranger here below. And then they both started singing the other harmony parts. And that's not a song that a lot of people know, I will tell you that.
It's in our booklet.
Well, that's unusual. Why is that?
Because it's a beautiful tune.
Oh, but it's a different arrangement.
It's a different arrangement.
That's the one. I tried to get them to put the arrangement that they know is from a book called The Harp of Ages. Is the one in here from?
This is the daily book.
Yeah, and the Harp of Ages arrangement, I have to say, is way better. I tried to get them to put that in there, but they were.
I think it's on the back of the last page. Conflict.
Yeah.
There we go. Oh.
In any case, it was just a beautiful little moment because all of a sudden there was all this sense of, wow, we're clearly, I don't even know what it is. Like we haven't even said the words yet, but there's something, a sense of tendrils, connections, belonging to something, The folks that song I Walked Abroad comes from, I told a story about last night without mentioning them, with friends. And there's I'll sort of tell a brief version of it again because I think it speaks to a similar theme that when I first met these folks, it was 20 odd years ago or something, and I was playing punk rock and this and that. I've been singing Sacred Harp for a long time already as well, but we heard through the grapevine, this was kind of before the internet, that some of these folks had a connection up north and they were going to be coming through, and maybe we could get together and meet them. And somehow via telephone was still connected to the wall. We got in touch with them and said, okay, we'll meet you at this, the Days Inn in Holyoke, Massachusetts, where they were going to be staying. And I was with two band members of mine, and we asked these folks, how are we going to recognize you? Because, there's no Facebook or whatever. And they said, well, we'll be the southern-looking people. And we wanted to sort of make a good impression and not alienate them, so we kind of, polished up our army boots and tried to, I put on my most conservative earring and tried to, dress how I thought maybe, a Georgia preacher might be okay with, to my, limited experience. And my buddy Bradford, he's played guitar in my band, when we from way back in the hardcore punk days. He had recently broken his foot, and he had a cane with drum skulls and barbed wire all over it, and he was, and the bass player in my band she kind of let her mohawk grow out just to, try to, again, look as normal as possible. We weren't very convincing, but maybe it was the effort that counted. But in any case, we went and met with them, and we had a sort of awkward meal at Denny's. And in later years, we found out after, joking with these folks that these friends, when they first came across, when they saw us coming across the parking lot, he said, well, we almost turned around and went right back into the hotel. But then after eating at Denny's, we went and started singing, and it was like two notes. It was just like this thing last night, and like hearing you guys today. It's like those two notes, and it was like, oh, all right. And I know this is stretching the theme of liberation, but I don't know, maybe it isn't even stretching it, because before you're liberated, I think from, not before or after, but in addition to liberation from any kind of physical circumstances, the ideas that we have about each other, being liberated from those things. Sometimes, you might actually have to literally cut the shackles first, and then, as happened with, historically with slavery, we're still dealing with ramifications, looking for liberation from many of the ideas, the false ideas that were a part of that. So just to throw that out there, that liberation from ideas is a big part of it. George Bernard Shaw said we must reform society before we reform ourselves. That's a very non-Puritan idea, but that's a kind of a socialist idea that kind of restructure the social system, and then that will give us the space to kind of work on our own issues. That's one way to think about it, or think about them both at once. Let's see what we can do with ourselves, within our own small sphere of influence, and how that might ripple out. So that's a little bit more talking than I meant to do around that. Thanks for doing that. What about the maritime music? That's a big question. But...
Well, it's unfortunate that David just stepped out. He's our Royal Navigator.
He's on his way back in.
Here he comes. But this idea of a boat project came to us, and it's always kind of been a funny thing to talk about because we live in the mountains, and so building a sailboat isn't the first thing you think of.
It worked for Noah,
and one of the ways we learn is more through phenomena than siloed subjects. And so if we're going to explore the phenomena of sailing in a sailboat, certainly the art and music around that culture is important. And so one of the tunes we learned is Away Rio, that David brought to us, and we were able to try and parse some harmonies.
Can we do it?
Yeah, let's sing it.
Yeah.
Yes.
You came in when we were singing it this morning.
Yeah, I was pretty impressed. The first thing I did meeting you guys, you're already singing. So. All right, we're off to a good start.
I just
Okay.
picked it up.
It was awesome.
Will you play it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to tune.
Okay, tune it up.
Hannah was playing in a key that is foreign to where we've been singing it, so we should probably sing it both ways and see how it feels.
That's a good idea.
Okay.
Sing the way you've been doing it first, and then see if we can add in some instruments.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Sure, it's fine with me.
What are we doing for the bus?
Perfectly.
It is in the book.
Can we do duo?
I'll drop the
duets,
guitar.
Let's sing the verses in duets. Who's going to sing
I
our
want
first
to do
verse?
one with somebody. I'm gonna meet God for this.
All right.
And Cassie.
These are handwritten pages.
Oh, please. Sure. Me, Cassie, and Ogden are doing one. You'll have to come around here. Yeah.
So I've got a first verse. You should do the second. While the girls sing the You guys want to do the third one? Skylar's got the third one.
I'll do the solo.
Sure. You're doing the first.
Okay, here we go. With me and Ogden.
We can do it a lot.
Are we doing instruments second?
Yeah, maybe we should.
All right, everybody ready?
Can I say one thing for clarity's sake? We're singing it without instruments first and with instruments second.
Sweet. Thanks, Jane. We'll man
The good captain and wander around.
away, Rio. We'll
Hold up the anchor from out of the sound.
and we're bound for the Rio Grande, and it's away, Rio, away, Rio. So fare you well, my pretty young girl, and we're bound for the Rio Grande. The anchor is weighed and the sails they are set. Away, Rio. The girls that we're leaving we'll never forget. And we're bound for the Rio Grande. And it's away, Rio. Away, Rio. So fare you well, my pretty young girl. And we're bound for the Rio Grande.
Our ship went is sailing out over the bar.
Away, Rio.
They pointed her bow to the bright southern star.
And we're bound for the Rio Grande. And it's away, Rio. Away, Rio. So fare you well, my pretty young girl. And we're bound for the Rio Grande. And it's away, Rio. Away, Rio. So fare you well, my pretty young girl. And we're bound for the Rio Grande.
Hey.
And
You guys are doing that for 2 hours straight.
Do it!
No, but seriously, just for a second, before we go on, just, imagine that being functional. You gotta be doing this thing. You gotta keep it going. But imagine on top of that, the experience of doing something for that rhythm and that song with that harmony over and over and over, and the way that works on you in community, and the sense of belonging.
Tim, I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So I've listened to a lot of sea shanties. I really love them. I know they're divided into short haul and long haul and all these different types. But I usually never can tell where is the moment that's coordinating the movement?
Oh,
The
so-
jerk on the road.
Yeah, that's what I should know. And there's a guy, Bennett Konechny is the guy, the work song guy that one of these days, Bennett and Edith, I'm sure they will come your way. They've done all kind of a worldwide study. Literally, they've been in Mongolia and in the South Pacific and parts of the African continent, finding songs. They do, one of the things they do is, there's a going to school song from, I think it's Tanzania. The kids are running to school and they pick each other up along the way. And it's all in rhythm. And then as more people come, it's the harmony goes in. So yeah, I'm not a work song person. I mean, talking about work song metaphorically person.
But we fell into it.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Like it was really easy, like.
Yeah.
But obviously there'll be a quick pull.
Yeah, because a lot of these things you're coordinating a lot of people that are tallying onto one rope, and they're having to coordinate a bit of a jerk. They're getting their body, their weight going, and they're jerking on the line rather than pulling on it.
and it's not together. It's great. I don't know if you ever listen to powwow music or if you've ever been to a powwow, but when I was living in Minnesota, I had a guy named Jerry Dearly and his sons come in, very wonderful powwow song leader, and this big drum, and it sounds like a lot of things sound simple, boom, 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 boom. When you're doing that with this big vibrating membrane, if you're not right on, you just get pushed back. You have to be right there, and it's that way with the singing too. If you ever listen to that music and the rhythm too, you have to be exactly right there. So a lot of times things do sound simpler than they're simple structurally, but to actually do them, you have to be together for real. And that's what I know about the shanties. I actually did do a thing where you went out in a boat. We were doing the rowing.
Oh, you were rowing shanty.
Yeah.
We used our oars, all four of us in our boat is set up with 4 big long oars. And at one point we were with Ian and several other kids, and we were trying to we were having trouble coordinating the rowing, and so we got going with Lever Johnny Lever.
Oh, so you found the one that worked for you.
Yeah.
And the speed you wanted to go.
Yeah.
Awesome. You guys all know that one, or?
It's easy to pick up.
We know.
Times were hard and the wages low. Lever Johnny Lever, I guess it's time for us to go. Time for us to leave her. Oh, it was rotten meat and weevily bread.
Lever, Johnny, lever.
It was pump or drown, the old man said, and it's time for us to leave her. What will we poor shellbacks do?
Leave us, Johnny, lever.
The money's got no work to do, and it's
Time for us to leave her.
Nice. Yeah, so, well, since we said we'd do it, let's try putting some instruments on the Rio Grand.
What key are you playing that in, Hannah?
C.
Key of C. C and G mainly.
It's S.
Oh, and it goes to the F, right? Should we do the same verses?
So the same people doing the verses?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Oh, it's the same person. Okay.
Skylar, you got this.
If you want to drop rather than look at your words, I'm happy to sing it for you. We're going to do it in the key of C, wherever that falls. Let's maybe listen to Hannah. Will you kick us off?
How should I do it?
How you feeling?
Oh no, it's in.
Just just start strumming and we'll start singing. Do you hear that?
There's way too many instruments.
Not everyone who is playing an instrument is singing.
Everyone's playing instruments free.
Well, I think there was also an intention not to drown out the instruments entirely, which if we sang at full volume, we certainly would have, I think.
Yeah.
I think everyone's playing.
It's also harder to play an instrument and sing at the same time.
Yeah.
It takes some of your energy.
I definitely noticed it just because I was like, paying attention to like, trying to like follow like the like percussion instruments and just kind of like do like that basically. So I was more focused on like, staying in beat versus singing. I did sing a little bit.
All right. I'll show you a song that touches on that. I think just on the sense of connection between these different practices, different traditions, and the ways that they played off each other, the way that sacred music has borrowed from work songs and other things, and the ways in which it's worked the other way around, the way they kind of cycle through. This is a song from the Millerite movement, the apocalyptic movement in the mid-19th century, 1840s, thereabouts. There was a guy named William Miller who was from western Massachusetts and then moved to eastern New York. And he was a kind of a lay preacher. He was not a real evangelist, but he was a kind of a amateur scholar of the Bible, and he did a lot of calculations looking at the books of Daniel and Revelation about there was throughout American culture in general, there's been this recurring sense of the end of the world, the apocalypse is coming, whether it was Y2K or things before that. And he basically, through doing math, figured out that the end of the world was going to come in 1843, this particular date. And he was hugely influential, this work, really up and down the eastern seaboard, even abroad. It wasn't some kind of a fringe movement. I mean, there was like the kind of thing where there was a fire one winter day at a paper mill in New Haven, Connecticut, on a weird kind of winter night when it was one of those winter nights when it's been cold and then it got warm and then it's all misty, and there was a fire that night, and the sky was so strange that people were running through the streets really convinced that it was the end. And a couple of things come together in this tradition. It was using existing music for kind of a new purpose, repurposing existing music, taking something that was already familiar and retooling it basically. That's one thing. Another thing was that this was a movement that it was way more culturally mixed than a lot of other movements. So they had what they called camp meetings, huge outdoor religious gatherings. Such things still exist in some form, but sometimes thousands of people gathering out in the field somewhere. And as you can imagine, in that kind of context, the normal social rules can break down. You don't have the normal separation in space. So you had people of European, African, Native American ancestry being in closer proximity to each other. And there's a thing that some people say in ethnomusicological circles, that people who study music, is that we have eyelids. You can shut your eyes, but you can't shut your ears. We don't have earlids. That just hearing people, can be profoundly influence, not just how you then sound, but really who you are. And certainly has profoundly influenced American music. There's a diary account of a white woman going to one of these camp meetings and saying that, we went to bed around midnight. We stopped singing around midnight, she said, but the Africans kept singing until dawn. So she heard, in those days, they used the term Africans to mean both. It was used kind of universally, both for African Americans and also for people from the African continent. This is, of course, during the time still of slavery, 1830s and 40s, at least in some parts of what's now the United States. And this movement, the Millerite movement, one of the critiques that white people had of it, many people had of it, was that it was not observing the proper boundaries between groups of people. The women and children preached at these outdoor revival meetings. People of African American descent, Native European, like I said, were in this kind of more mixed context. And the music that came out of it, I often call it Afro-Celtic gospel, which is kind of a joke, but also kind of true. And aside from just being a great song, it illustrates some of the ways in which we exclude ourselves from belonging by making these categories that don't really exist sometimes, or they're not as rigid. They're much more permeable. Like I was saying with this friendship song, it's a hymn, it's a drinking song, it's a march, it's a dance tune. Likewise, some of these categories, like African American music. It's not to say that that's not a meaningful category or an idea, but there's also been this term white spirituals that was coined by folklorists in the 1920s and 30s, which is really misleading because it excludes it ignores the fact. It looks at the fact that when they discovered some of this shape note music, when folklorists discovered it, of course the people that were doing it didn't need to discover it, but when academics found these people, the communities that they were going into were largely white communities in the southern uplands. And it's taken a long time to kind of undo some of those ideas, like the idea that, that's white people music, this is black people music. The more you look at a lot of these things, the more you see, actually, people were listening to each other. They couldn't help but hear each other. Right? That's way too much talk about this song. So it's an Afro-Celtic apocalyptic gospel song from the state of Maine that also works as could be a sea shanty. The chorus goes, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, oh, Gabriel's going to blow by and by. You got it already, yeah? Gabriel's gonna blow
from on high, from on high.
Oh,
Gabriel's gonna blow high and high.
So I'll sing the verses, and then as you see how the structure goes, you can start singing the verses as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about the structure and how that, I'll leave the talk for now, but pay attention as we go to the structure. You see the dead arising, arising, arising. Oh, you see the dead arising on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow
from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by.
Oh, you'll hear the saints rejoicing, rejoicing, rejoicing. Oh, you'll hear the saints rejoicing on that great day.
Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by.
All the stars will be a-falling, falling, falling. All the stars will be a-falling on that great day.
Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by.
And the moon will be bleeding, bleeding, bleeding. Oh, the moon will be bleeding on that great day.
Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by.
All the stars will be falling, falling, falling. All the stars will be falling on that great day.
Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by.
All the seas will be boiling, boiling,
Boiling, oh, the seas will be a-boiling on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow from on high.
Oh, sisters, are you ready? Ready, ready.
Oh, sisters, are you
ready for that great day? Oh,
Gabriel's gonna blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by.
may we all sing together, together, together. May we all
sing together on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by.
be unbroken,
Unbroken, unbroken.
oh,
May the storm be unbroken on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow high and high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow high and high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow high and high.
Right. first any questions?
What's the time frame? That was 1830.
October 1843.
And what's the Celtic part of that?
That's a great question. It's partly me being a little bit facetious, but not really, because like a lot of these tunes that got written down, and this is a little bit going into the weeds historically, but folklorists, some of them went to great effort to prove that these things had, they're Scottish. They must be Scottish. They sound kind of African, and they were written down by a white guy who lived in a community, in a household with 6 people and like 200 enslaved Africans. This is like one composer in the Sacred Harp, some of his tunes that sound a little bit West African, kind of. Why? Is it because they're Scottish, or is it? But so I think that to me anyway, there's some suggestion, very strong suggestion of shared tradition, not shared in the lovey-dovey way, but just by the fact that we hear each other. We can't help hearing each other, and we're in this together whether we like it or not. And music is such a good evidence of that. You kind of can't keep that stuff out. There are people who put a lot of effort to keeping some of the effort to make music of a certain kind pure. You may have found this. I don't know if you ever found this in any kind of music that you've been involved with, but I've seen it in punk rock, I've seen it in reggae, in old time music, in shape note music, trying to keep it pure. And that's sometimes, often, at least in American context, that's kind of not too subtle euphemism for segregation, in a sense, if you can do it in music. That's again way too much of an answer, but I think it's just like that some of these things, they might sound kind of Celtic and they might sound West African, and it's probably because they are.
There is some of that here in this community. Music is really important in this community, as you've maybe gotten a glimpse of already, and will continue to hopefully while you're here. But the old time and the bluegrass camps are very, there are very specific rules about things you do and don't do during the old time jam versus the bluegrass jam. And I don't know a ton about it, but I know enough about it to know that those traditions are very important to each of those individual groups.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up this thing of how belonging can be facilitated through excluding. You know what I mean? And like if you want to feel like you're part of something, one of the ways is to sort of say, well, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not that. This heavy metal and punk is another thing way back when. Like, oh, we're not that. So establishing a sense of belonging through excluding. Just something to be aware of. In the Sacred Harp tradition, I feel like, for me, I sing those songs in a lot of different contexts. I sing them with the rock band, with the fiddle, with any kind of imaginable. I just love singing those songs, and I think they respond well to different treatments. But for the Sacred Harp context, it's almost like the rules facilitate a sense of belonging, not so much through exclusion, not so much so, oh, we're not that stuff, but just like, these are the rules we're playing by right now, and that gives a kind of a freedom. Like, I'm not going to back price into the square when I'm leading a song. That's not going to help anybody. It's not going to facilitate. It's not going to bring the kind of joy that you can bring through this. It's like playing chess and somebody starts throwing Monopoly money on the board. Like, I don't know what's happening anymore. I just, there's room for navigating these things, and over time, the Sacred Harp continues to change. It's a living thing. It's not a chessboard that's always going to be the same rules. It does continue to evolve, and there's pushing and pulling, and like any group of people, it's imperfect. It's very imperfect. And sometimes you've come to, consensus through really difficult waters. but so that's about the Sacred Harp. To me, those are two things to balance in thinking about belonging. When there's a clear sense of structure that you can work with that facilitates you being you and also getting the work done, and versus, or not maybe not versus, but in juxtaposition to this sense of we belong because we're not that. We're all one because those people, there's a joke that a rabbi told me that illustrates this very human tendency. He says there's a rabbi who was marooned, you ever heard this one, marooned on a desert island, and after 20 years, finally a ship comes, and he says, oh, this is so great, wow, I've been wanting to be rescued. But first let me show you my island. I've spent all this time building this place. He said, here's my home, I built it myself. And here's where here's where I go fishing. I built this dock here. And here's my synagogue. I built this very specially, And then the people say, well, what's that place across the street? He says, oh, that place, I wouldn't set foot in that place. I don't know if you get the joke. Structuring your own other. Creating the thing that you don't want to be because you don't know how to be yourself without saying, I'm not going over there, so I need to build it. So I don't go there. Or something. That place, I wouldn't set foot in that place. Anyway. Where I was going to go next was the song structure, wondering if you remember the song after all my talking. Is there anything you noticed, or just not the experience of singing that? You picked it up pretty darn quick.
It feels like I could just make up something and then everyone could
Aha!
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't
Good answer.
I didn't mean that to be such a rhetorical question.
Jam time.
Well, so so I don't know if you noticed, but there's no rhyming in there, and there's not even really any verses. There are things of 7 syllables. The moon will be a bleeding, the stars will be a falling, the seas will be a boiling. May we all sing together. May the circle be unbroken. Think of something else with 7 syllables or thereabouts that vaguely refers to the end of the world, or to some desire for that kind of sense of belonging that these songs often express, like the very familial kind of brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, desire to be together. I don't know if you know, you must know the song, Will the Circle Be Unbroken?
Sure.
And I don't know, I think a lot of people, at least where I come from, don't recognize that circle being the family circle, and how, how much that sentiment, how deep that sentiment runs. May the circle be unbroken. Don't separate me from these people. I want to be, that's one of the deepest things I think that we feel. But the fact that there's only 7 syllables and doesn't have to be rhyming, it makes it possible to improvise. If you can think of a 7-syllable phrase, and then you just repeat it. And that does a couple of things. It stretches the song out ad nauseum for as long as you want to go. It creates an opportunity for people to jump in with their own thought. So within the context of this social activity, being able to contribute your own thing to it. So the other thing that is interesting about that to me is that it seems to me to be evidence of this kind of African influence that might be subtle, but improvisation in American culture is something that's very closely associated with African influence. Not 100% because there's improvisation everywhere you look, but it's been a particularly strong contribution within all of these, jazz, pop, rock, blah, 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 blues. sense of extemporaneous creation, making something happen in the moment. Yep.
A lot of times when we're working on a hard tune, Jenny will say, Chris, can we just sing something we can rest in? And I could really feel that in that tune, where the logic, the structure of the song was readily apparent. And I didn't have to think too hard or work too hard about finding my place. And so there's something about that structure that really lends itself to creating a sense of, we can do this together, and we can all belong in this.
Do you have, is there one in particular that you guys could?
A song to rest in?
Yeah.
Sure. So, Dona Nobis Pacem is around that many people know in many contexts, and we've learned, and it's one that I've had the experience of coming into a community where I don't know anyone, and this is a song we can sing together and find beautiful harmony.
Oh, great. So, I would love that, and I'd love to make that a segue into a song from the Sacred Harp.
Awesome.
Just
so this is in your folders if you don't know this one already. First page. Nice and low. And we'll sing it all the way through, and then we'll do it in 3 parts. No, no, please, Pacem, Pacem. No, nobis, Pacem. Sometimes we rest in that more than others, depending on who you can lean on and where I happen to key it.
Ian, I almost went on. You almost went on. Yes, we should have done that song. We should have kept that song in the book, Chris.
There's so many interesting things that this all brings up. I mean, you know, you've probably been through the experience of trying to find songs in common or music in common, and that's that's, well, I had this experience. I was playing in a rock band in South India, and we were trying to find songs to play, and the bass player was Nigerian because there's a big institution, technology college in Chennai in southern India. And it was, for me, this kind of amazing experience. I don't even remember what the song was now, but at some point we were trying to figure out what songs to do, and then this Nigerian guy started playing something. I was like, it felt like, oh, Western culture. It was like suddenly like, ah, this is familiar. Even though I was studying Indian music, it's sort of finding this familiar, even just a groove, a sense of, oh yeah, we are a part of that. And that can be such a beautiful thing with songs that you know from some of the context, and like you were saying, coming into a new context. And I wanted to introduce that, use that as a way of introducing a song that you may know from the Sacred Harp. It's one of the most common songs in the Sacred Harp, but it's one that very, the way it was used, very explicitly speaks to the idea of using traditional or existing music towards the goal of literal belonging in the moment and to a movement, and literal liberation, in this case, the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. So if we could grab some Sacred Harps, are they?
There's a box of them.
There's a cup with that.
You probably have a dozen there, so
We
folks
gotta
can
be
share.
able to share a dozen. And you know, I have the mixed blessing of having done a PhD and liking to talk about it. But one of the things I often come back to, that's a little square but interesting about Sacred Harp singing, and the kind of the world around it, not just Sacred Harp, but the kind of the whole history that surrounds it, is that a lot of the traditions, when I teach this, I often talk about more in terms of innovation than tradition, because traditions, it's like, well, yeah, that's what we do. It's important to know what we do if you want to do it with us. But why is often because they were brilliant ideas in the first place, and they stuck around because they really worked. And at the heart of this innovation in this particular community singing tradition, as far as I can see, is the idea that it is good to sing together. And that's something that wasn't new with the Protestant Reformation, but it was really drilled home in the European movement to make worship more accessible to regular people in the language that they spoke communally. So Mass, while Mass could be celebrated without participation, particularly, you can celebrate Mass in the Catholic or Orthodox fashion. But with the Protestant Reformation came the idea of, they reoriented the space, first of all. So rather than lengthwise, they reoriented around the sidewall. And then you had to have a preacher, and then you had to have a congregation. To have a preacher, it doesn't make any sense without a congregation. So there's right away, there's a kind of a dialogue, there's a kind of a conversation that's very implicit just in Protestantism in general. And then I should say that it's while this is a thoroughly, Sacred Harp singing is really radically open, it is coming out of this Protestant tradition. So Martin Luther, you might have heard of, he famously said that singing was one of the most important things, maybe almost second to preaching. And singing together, partly because of the effect, that emotional effect that it had, that bonding effect. So they wanted to make it possible, as accessible as possible for everyone to sing. There were a lot of different innovations. There's something called lining out, which we could mess around with later. But the shape notes themselves, even the shape notes, the idea of making music accessible, making it possible for everyone to sing, is very deeply ingrained, coming out of this the kind of Reformation tradition. If you look on page 40, can everybody see one? You may well know this song. 1782, written by this Massachusetts composer Louis Edson. So it was a new song. It was a it was in a sense pop music. It was youth music. The singing schools of the 1780s and thereabouts, the average age was about the age of your schoolmates. You know, it was people in their teens who were going to these, on these winter nights, bringing a candle, maybe taking a sleigh ride down to the tavern, and learning to sing. And it was tremendously fun. So much so that some of the older people objected to it, you know, this newfangled music. And it was often the first choir music in the United States, outside of Catholic, certainly outside of Spanish, existing Spanish traditions. But the first kind of Protestant choir music grew out of this stuff, songs like Lennox. And it was young people. It was young people who had gone to singing schools together. They loved singing together. They bonded over it. They sang in the streets even, sometimes. And then they sometimes had to even petition the church to be allowed to sit together. There's one of my favorite local characters from where I live up in Western Mass. He was a singing master that I discovered by the name of Royal Joy. That was his actual name. Royal Joy. And he was hired by the town to teach a singing school, and it was the first introduction of kind of music education in the town. And I was doing a workshop introducing this music there. I did it a couple of years in a row, and each year I did a little more research. And then just last year I realized that Royal Joy, who was hired by the town to teach music, when they hired him he was 12. So the 12-year-old singing master named Royal Joy. And this would have been one of the songs that he sang. So this was youth music for these people. This was like, this is cool new music that we're doing. Fast forward to the 1850s. You know, these people were now senior citizens who'd learned this when they were kids, if they were still around. This was music that had a deep sense of history for them. You know, remember way back when. Imagine that, the emotion, well, some of you can't imagine, but you can imagine what it feels like to remember 2 years ago when you were at your old school or your old friends, or, you know, just the tugging on the heartstrings. Sort of extend that over the decades. And imagine music, the sound of music, bringing you back to something really fundamental, like a smell in your grandparents' attic or something. This music was used that way in the abolition movement by singers of both European and African ancestry. And contrary to what I believed until I started looking into it, at least in New England, they typically worshiped together. The Congregationalist churches were very stratified. They were not egalitarian. You hear about the Puritans being all about equality and stuff. They were very very hierarchical. The rich people got to sit up front. Black people had to sit in the gallery, which, by the way, is where the choirs wound up being. That used to be where they would call the truant boys and whatnot, and people of lower social status would be sort of up in the gallery, where the choirs wound up. But they sort of hit upon this formula of singing this old music. There's one guy in particular, a guy named Henry Wright, who was a fascinating abolitionist, feminist, anarchist. He realized that singing this old music pulled really hard on people's sense of nostalgia and their sense of home. And he realized he could use that by then saying, he gave a sermon in a town nearby in Greenfield, Massachusetts, at one of these singings where the old people were getting together to sing this music. He said, just think of how that reminds you of home and family and your community and singing with everyone, you know. And now imagine somebody who's been torn from their family, who's been enslaved, and who has nothing that they can sing that would bring them joy to remember their childhood, but would bring them only pain to remember the separation. He used the music like that. And in the moment it created a sense of togetherness for a cause. And again, singing in the moment, but towards this broader thing. And this song of all of these old songs that they sang in this abolitionist context. When the clock struck midnight in 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted, this was apparently what they sang. A group of people of European, African, Native American ancestry. Ralph Waldo Emerson was there, Harriet Beecher Stowe, a number of prominent black abolitionists in Boston. When the clock struck 12, they apparently sang, the year of Jubilee is come, return ye ransomed sinners home. They had been singing this song for years before that with separate words. Blow ye the trumpet, blow the gladly solemn sound, let all the nations know, to earth's remotest bound. They had been singing it to a new text, an abolitionist text, using the tune to call up those memories of family and home and familiarity, but using the text to advocate for this change. So that's a lot of talking, but let's sing that. Let's sing this song. Do you know it?
We haven't learned it as a school.
Okay.
I certainly know.
Let's look at it. Let's look at the tenor first. Yeah, so the third line from the top. Let's all sing it together. You know what we can do? I've taken to doing this lately, which is we can do verse 3 with the tune, rather than doing the notes again, as we would typically do. The gospel trumpet hear, the news of heavenly grace, and saved from earth appear before your Savior's face. In case you find it easier to sing on the words than on the notes, the gospel, here we go. The gospel trumpet hear, the news of heavenly grace, and save from earth appear before your Savior's face. Here we go. The year of Jubilee is come, the year of Jubilee is come, return ye ransomed sinners home. Now let's look at the bass. It's a little bit low, but we can do it. Here we go. Sol, sol, la, sol, fa, sol, fa. La, sol, la, fa, sol, sol, fa, la, fa, sol, fa. Fa, sol, 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 fa, la, 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 sol, fa, la, fa, la, sol, 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 fa, fa, sol, sol, fa. It's a bit ridiculously long. I'll take that. It's still feeling early in the morning, but no, I'll take it up. Oh, la, sol, fa, sol, la, fa. Let's try it on verse 3, the gospel trumpet. Here we go. Oh, gospel trumpet, hear the news of heavenly grace, and safe from earth appear before your Savior's face. The year of Jubilee is come, the year of Jubilee is come, return ye ransomed sinners home. And I don't know how many of you, will everybody come sing tonight, or is that?
Some might.
We can do it some more tonight, and then what I'm hoping is that I'm giving a little presentation tomorrow, in which I'll hopefully try to make some of these things a little clearer, but get some of us to sing a couple of these songs. Fa, fa. Let's sing the treble now.
Top line.
There we go.
That's
So, my agenda in that is, number one, just singing a very cool song. Two, introducing you to a bit of the history of that particular song, and asking you to imagine being in that context, being amongst 2,000 people who've been fighting for, some of them their whole lives, some of them for decades, for the achievement of this particular goal. They worked hard together. Some of them had been killed. Many had been killed. And all knew someone who had sacrificed, who had suffered. And then, in this particular moment, being able to sing this song, many of whom had known their whole lives, as an expression of genuine jubilee, sense of achievement, and look what we've been able to facilitate. Look what happened. Just kind of imagine the feeling. Like 2,000 people singing that song loud on a bad day when nothing else was going on in the world. It's pretty potent. 2,000 people on a day on the moment when slavery was officially ended, which they've been working for. I can't imagine a new song that could have brought that feeling. You know what I'm saying? There were many new songs that were proposed in the abolitionist movement and in many movements since. But I wanted to highlight emphasize the power of a song that had become traditional, a song that had become familiar, that was ingrained, that was embodied, that in the community, not just in yourself, that had this expansive tendrils or going off in different directions, where you could go into a group of people you never met before and start singing that song and automatically feel, oh yeah, okay, here we are. That's kind of where I wanted to go with that.
So we're coming to the end of our time this morning. We have about 5 minutes, and I imagine Focus and Ladders are in need of a break.
Yeah.
But I wonder, and this might not be the right place to close, but it's something that I think bears speaking to. Some of us here are Christians, some of us really not.
Yeah.
And to sing some of these words can be challenging for someone who doesn't have that orientation.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of folks who have a lot of wounding around some of that language. And so I wonder if you want to speak to a little bit of how different people come to it and find belonging, even if it's not a belief they subscribe to.
Yeah. And some don't. And some, there are people who, there's a lot of different answers to that. One thing is that within the Sacred Harp tradition, sort of from the get-go, there was a real desire to get beyond partisanship. Because even within, forget about American Protestantism, micro-American, within these little regions, there was so much bickering and fighting theologically and otherwise within families. In some of the churches up where I live, they split over musical issues, let alone even theological ones. They're like, we don't want to sing that kind of music. And so with this kind of, with Sacred Harp singing, there was a real desire from the get-go to have this be a place where you could get to leave your baggage at the door, leave your politics at the door. It was assumed that most people would be broadly Christian. As the tradition has grown and as it's expanded out into the world, and as people from outside of the Sacred Harp singing strongholds have found it, and found it to be a beautiful thing, there has been, it hasn't been uncomplicated, it hasn't been always easy, but it has been, there's been a real beautiful kind of move towards finding a way to do this in a way that doesn't ask of anyone that they contribute more than they can, that they sign on some dotted line of belief or adherence to something. It is, of course, tricky when it comes to something. It can be tricky. It's tricky sometimes for people within the communities who have been singing it for ages, because there are doctrinal differences in some of the texts in here, and I've been with people who've had generations of Sacred Harp singers in their families, and there's some words that they won't sing because they're not comfortable with them. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen even in those contexts. And my experience has been, I could go on about this and wait. Boy, I had a lot of experience with this, but you ask any Sacred Harp singer, however long they've been singing, they will tell you that you are welcome, and truly so. That doesn't address the issue of how to sing something that if you, especially if you've been wounded. I have a dear friend who sang with us for a while, who just after a while just couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't sing those words, even though she deeply loved the singing, and many of the ideas, there were just enough things that hurt that she couldn't do it. So it's an imperfect tradition, like anything that people do when they get together. It's imperfect. But there is a desire, I know, among singers, be they of a conservative or a liberal stripe, be they Christian or otherwise, there is a desire to share that sense of belonging that is so profound that comes in this music.
Beautiful.
And I could tell you examples, but maybe say that.
Probably save it for tomorrow, I guess.
Yeah, so I think with the having said that about tradition and the using, I didn't get into, like banjo and fiddle music that has all this the profound evidences of connection where people would speak of disconnection, belonging where people would speak of shunning or othering. But so just keep in mind a little bit for tomorrow. All right, so that's what we can do with traditional music that's familiar, that's already in us. So how can we bring some of these desires, these goals of facilitating belonging, in some sense, striving towards liberation, whether it's individual or whether it is some social concern or spiritual concern. How do we bring that to songwriting, either in terms of text that we're singing about, the way that the structure, the way it facilitates, whether it's something in the music itself that might speak to or bring into being some of that. I talked more than I wanted.
I'll say something real quick, just because that last one I was thinking about before you asked. The Jubilee is a Hebrew thing.
Oh yeah.
So, and it's on the Liberty Bell. If you go to Philadelphia, you can read it. It's from a distance. But it was like in the books of Moses, there's a 7-year cycle of things, right? 7-year people are released, slaves are released, from their temporary 7-year slavery. And 7 years of 7 is like a super Sabbath year. That's the Jubilee. So,
All your debts are forgiven.
Jubilee release, yeah. Land goes back to the original owners. Slaves are released. So proclaim the Jubilee.
Thank you for
This goes way back, yeah.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah.
It's been a real treat.
Thank you guys for sharing your songs with me, and now I'm motivated to have to learn how to learn the movement and stuff.